Hello, my friends. This is Dr. Deepak Chopra, and it's my privilege to have a very special guest. I'll tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll all learn a lot from him. We're continuing these conversations with what I call a motley group of sages, scientists, psychotics, and geniuses. So you'll have to decide which category this conversation fits into. But it's my great pleasure to invite today Robin Carhart-Harris, professor at UCSF, where, by the way, I also teach at the medical school. So it's a great privilege to have you now as a colleague as well. And I have been following your work, Robin. I'm a big fan, watched all your videos, looked at your TED Talk, looked at some of the papers you've published. So very grateful that you can join this conversation.
Thank you, Deepak. It's an honor and privilege to be here with you.
Thank you. So let me just tell you very briefly, 1966 in medical school in India, All India Institute of Medical Sciences. I was part of a controlled experiment with LSD from Harvard Medical School. And where there were several medical students who were given a placebo, and I happened to be in the LSD group. And so 66, probably before you were born, way before you were born.
Yeah, 1980.
I got into this field, and periodically I have of course, stayed in touch with the researchers in this field. And I'm in New York right now, where I work with a neuropsychiatrist called Geeta Vade. She's from Oxford, actually. And we do a lot of protocols involving psychedelics and terminal care, psychedelics and depression, psychedelics and immersive experiences, psychedelics and VR, psychedelics and guided meditation, etc. So I have a bit of a background, but having looked at all your work, I'm just totally in awe of the contribution you've already made in this field. So once again, thank you. I'd like, I read a little bit about your history and your background. Share with our audience, who's a lay audience, they do not understand science, although I'd like to get into the science, serotonin agonism and default mode network. But share with our audience who has no knowledge of science, what you think the promise of psychedelics is and why you are so immersed in it. Because, I saw from looking at your videos that you are also very interested in what I would call the hard problem of consciousness. So it's all yours now for the next few minutes, and then I'll maybe occasionally interrupt to ask you questions. Go ahead, sir.
Well, thank you, Deepak. Do you know, in a sense, you could go straight into the name itself, psychedelic. These are the compounds that I study, that I, hope to study back in early to mid 2000s, when I discovered a book by Stanislav Grof called Realms of the Human Unconscious, and I was studying psychoanalysis at the time and enjoying that, but also experiencing some ambivalence, because I suppose in a kind of pragmatic, positivist way, I wanted it to be more concrete, I wanted to be able to test some of the principles of psychoanalysis in a more concrete way and sort of demonstrate its validity. I sensed that it had really strong explanatory power. But I was somewhat frustrated at its sort of lack of sort of scientific rigor in its methodology. And then I found this book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, that suggested that LSD could reveal the unconscious mind, make it manifest to conscious awareness. And this was a light bulb moment for me. It really changed my life, finding that book and reading that book. And then I knew that that's what I wanted to study. I said I'd go straight to the name psychedelic, and I sort of danced around it, but psychedelic is meant to denote the key property of these compounds, which is to reveal the psyche, to make the psyche manifest. And I suppose by implication there, that would say that the psyche ordinarily isn't fully manifest, that there's, you know, aspects of it that aren't available to conscious awareness. And through the action of these compounds, those aspects can be made available. And you know, that was the chosen term of Humphrey Osmond in conversation with Aldous Huxley in the sort of mid to late 1950s, and Osmond came up with this term, and it's stuck. Mostly it's stuck, and I'm glad it has, because I think it does. When people hear the etymology, you know, they can know that it's speaking to what I believe is a principal action of these compounds, what they do, principal property. Yeah.
So what does the term exactly mean?
Psyche, really the most literal translation would be soul. We tend to think of it as mind, but it's deeper than that. The ancient Greek term, I think, is referring to soul. And then the delic, I think, derives from delosse, I would guess, which means to make visible or to make manifest. So to make the soul manifest, to make the soul visible, is probably the most sort of literal translation of psychedelic.
So let's go directly from there to make the soul manifest. And, you know, just as an aside, I have been a colleague of Stanislav Grof as well, and he's a great friend, and I think he's just amazing in his contribution to our understanding of what we are calling the soul or consciousness or awareness. And, you know, in Eastern wisdom traditions, and I kind of sense that you are sympathetic to this idea. In Eastern wisdom tradition, when a child is born, it has something called pure consciousness, which means it's not been contaminated yet by social constructs or economic constructs or historical constructs or religious constructs. And so the expression of innocence in a child is one of curiosity, wonder, playfulness, joy, and friendliness. And a child is perfect embodiment of innocence without the conditioned mind. There's a phrase in India: every child that is born is proof that God has not yet given up on human beings. So looking at what you've been saying in some of your videos is that perhaps the most important contribution of psychedelics is to actually bypass, or for the moment go beyond, the conditioned mind. So we return to that original state of innocence, which is not only innocence, but is also combined with curiosity, very creative. That therefore creativity can also be unleashed as a result of going beyond the conditioned mind, and you being the science behind it. I would love to hear from you about default mode network and serotonin agonism, which I've been reading is some of your contribution. In fact, is a lot of your contribution.
Yeah, well, we do know to an extent what these classic psychedelics do in the brain. So we know that they work on the serotonin system, a really important neuromodulatory system that tunes the brain in particular ways. Serotonin does a lot of stuff. In fact, most serotonin is actually outside of the brain. I think 90% plus is actually in our gut. But in the brain, it does some important stuff. No doubt it does important things in the gastrointestinal system, but yeah, in the brain, it's involved in mood and cognition and sleep and conscious states. And we know that psychedelics, they stimulate a certain serotonin receptor. And these receptors are like, they're kind of like locks. If serotonin's the key, they're like locks that when unlocked will tune brain function in different ways. And there's loads of these serotonin receptors. Serotonin is a really complex system involved in a lot of different things, but we know with a pretty good degree of precision and confidence that a particular serotonin receptor, it's called the serotonin 2A receptor, is a critical component of the action of psychedelics. I guess a long story short, when you stimulate these receptors, which are heavily expressed in the cortex, and it gets more interesting, they're heavily expressed in the most evolutionary recent cortex, which of course humans have so much of. It's what, sets us apart as especially weird animals. Yeah, when you stimulate these 2A receptors in this recent brain, if you want, it dysregulates the activity there. It has what I've described as an entropic action. It excites these regions and the cells within them, but it does so in a way that sort of dysregulates their function. It makes their activity, at least in the cortex, less predictable, more disordered, more random. And because of that, I believe that it allows an opportunity for, again, long story short, for kind of relearning, like major shifts in perspective, actually to get out of the conditioned mind, which is likely to be encoded, especially by the recent cortex, by the recent brain, the human brain, if you want, that conditioned mind, who you are, your ego, and so on, encoded in that particular aspect of brain. And it's that particular aspect of brain that's kind of, dysregulated, scrambled up in a sense under the action of the psychedelics.
Here's a question. I also was, since you mentioned all this Huxley, and I'm now getting on 76 years, I've met all these people occasionally. And Laura Huxley, his widow, was a very close friend of mine. So she regaled me with a lot of stories about all this Huxley, Brave New World, and all the experiments they did together, along with other people like Bob Thurman and Richard Alpert, who was originally kicked out with Tim O'Leary. And, I became friends with Tim O'Leary's former wife, who married Richard Alpert, then became Ram Das. But I have some questions based on just what you said. One is, since the gut is an extended brain, coming from the neuroectoderm, and incidentally, in the 70s, I was training with Seymour Reichland at Tufts University. After I'd finished my residency and training in neuroendocrinology, I was with Seymour Reichland, who's 97 now. At that time, he was the president of the Endocrine Society. He now lives in Arizona, but every year he comes to NYU here and does a short sabbatical, still argues with me about the hard problem of consciousness. If he finds a snake in his garden at the age of 97, he looks for receptors. So in the 1970s, I was his fellow. And we were looking at all these molecules: serotonin, dopamine, opiates, oxytocin, something called anandamide. And then, one of our colleagues at that time, who was training at Georgetown, Candice Pert, who later, she was actually the discoverer of the opioid receptor. And so we were looking at these neurotransmitters, 1970s. And one day she made the comment, these are molecules of emotion. And I said, why don't you write a book on that? And she did. I wrote the introduction. It became a huge bestseller. Her boss got the Wolf Prize for her contribution to opiate receptors, even though she had discovered them. And that's the usual story. But she passed away. And in the end, she was acknowledged as the discoverer of the opioid receptor. But I'm actually curious what your thoughts are. Since the neuroendocrine axis and neuroectoderm is both, the gut and the brain, is there any reason not to suppose that these psychedelics that you're talking about that increase serotonin agonism could do that also through the gut, not just through the brain?
Yes, in fact, it looks like they do. I think there's certainly a lot of serotonin receptors in the gut, and the action of there's some early research looking at LSD on, I think it's sheep intestine and its vascular action, and it was there that they found that LSD constricted the blood vessels in the sheep intestine, and this was one of the early findings that LSD could be vasoconstrictive. And actually, I think the origin of the term serotonin was linked to the vascular action of that chemical, that it was found in the serum, in the blood, and that it affected the tone of the vessels, hence serotonin. And so this vascular action and how that's going to affect gut, I guess, motility, is part of the picture. It's part of the picture. And of course, we, personally speaking as well, can be quite brain-centric in my approach to these compounds, in our approach. And it may well be that we're missing some tricks outside of the brain. And yeah, and then not to go to the rest of the body in isolation, but actually to look at body to brain coupling, how they interrelate is a particularly interesting area for the research to go in now, I think.
So, when I talk to you, you're an academic, you're a scientist, you just said you're brain-centric, and, you bring out the details of what is happening in the body. But then, as a trained neuroendocrinologist, obviously I'm very interested in that aspect of psychedelics. But, when it comes to language, there is a whole body of language in Eastern wisdom traditions that does not separate what we call the autonomic nervous system from the brain. So the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. In fact, I'm holding a book in my hand right now on what is called the polyvagal theory. So, and I talk to these scientists who have recently become interested in the Eastern perspective. So the Eastern perspective is Eastern wisdom traditions perspective and Ayurveda perspective, which is a healing modality, and the yogic perspective. They're all kind of combined. The brain, the parasympathetic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system, including the sympathetic nervous system, they are one system. And in yoga, what we call the subconscious mind is called the supraconscious mind, because monitoring everything without your conscious control. Right now, you and I are doing nothing to regulate our blood pressure or our endocrine system or self-regulation or homeostasis, nothing of the sort. So it's actually supraconscious rather than subconscious. And the yogis train themselves to actually bring the subconscious to the conscious level or the supraconscious, so we can actually influence directly vagal tone through various procedures, breathing exercises, yoga, toning, many things. We understand the anatomy of the polyvagal theory, and we can actually bring to the conscious awareness what's happening in the so-called subconscious mind, which we call supraconscious, and then we can train the autonomic nervous system to actually listen to our instructions, because we can go to that deep level of awareness. And what is becoming very clear in that aspect is that the mind that we call conscious is the least conscious. That we call subconscious is the most conscious, because eavesdropping on everything that's happening in your body. And that psychedelics are actually opening the window to the unity between what we call the brain, the autonomic nervous system, and the rest of the body. And when we combine all the reductionist understanding of what's happening in the brain, we can look for it elsewhere in the body, because it's a unified process.
Yes, so I'd like to think that's, a direction that at least some cognitive neuroscientists are taking now, to better appreciate the interrelated nature of the brain to the body. And in the context of psychedelics, it kind of invites that their effects invite that kind of holistic perspective. And also, in psychiatry, it invites a holistic perspective on mental health that isn't, so biocentric as has been in recent decades in psychiatry. It's been very biocentric, but arguably now more than ever, and through psychedelics, it invites more of a holistic biopsychosocial approach to mental health. So this sort of multiple systems and scales and interactions between systems and scales and aspects of experience is a direction of travel that I welcome. And like I said, I think it's invited by the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience.
I have one more comment, and I want to ask you specific questions and your take on it. So the one more comment was, during the pandemic, actually two more comments. During the pandemic, our foundation, it's called the Chopra Foundation, which is a 501c3, and we do a lot of meta-analysis and research. And so we were looking at all the people who were getting sick during the pandemic, the older ones with all this, chronic illness and all that. And the younger ones were having what we call cytokine storms, inflammatory storms, but they all had sympathetic overdrive. And then our meta-analysis also has revealed through a librarian, we have a librarian who used to work for Wikipedia, and we did this meta-analysis that almost everyone with chronic illness, almost everyone, they have depression, anxiety, and inflammation preceding chronic illness, sometimes by several decades. So, to look at biology and psychology as two different things doesn't make sense anymore. That whatever happens in the body affects the psyche, whatever happens in the psyche affects the body. And they have to be one thing, whatever that one thing is. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to lift my arm. It starts with a thought and ends up with a biological response. So whatever it is, that it has to be one unit. Otherwise, it violates all the laws of thermodynamics. So given that, I'm going to ask you just short questions and your opinion. Psychedelics and chronic disease.
Okay, physical disease, or do we not make that distinction?
I'm asking right now, chronic physical disease.
Yeah.
Like diabetes, metabolic syndrome, autoimmune illness, cancer.
Well, we did do a bit of sort of population level analyses on cardiovascular disease and diabetes, and we did find something that was positive in relation to lower rates in people with some, I think, recent history of psychedelic use. There have been a few of these population type analyses looking at different things like mental health indices like psychological distress and how they're lower in people who report a recent history of psychedelic use. So yeah, we have seen something there. And again, it speaks to, mind to and brain to body coupling and a challenge to the sort of splitting of those systems as distinct things. So yeah, intriguing possibilities there. Also inflammation, there's some reasons to think that the action of psychedelics could counter processes of inflammation. Quite what the mechanisms are, they're not clear, but they could actually involve an aspect of the pharmacology of the psychedelics acting on the serotonin system. So a lot of intriguing angles there. There are now studies looking at neurological disorders with psychedelics, as well as, of course, the research, a lot of research happening in psychiatry now, looking at psychedelic therapy for depression and addiction and so on, but also looking at Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Now, I want to put a little caveat in there that there's no compelling evidence of sort of reduction in core markers of pathology in those neurological disorders as yet. And those studies are sort of proposing to treat more the psychiatric ancillary symptoms or, extra symptoms that go along with the neurological disorder. But anyway, that work's happening and it's an exciting time because we'll see what comes out of it. Yeah.
Well, that's very helpful because I get a lot of queries now on psychedelics and neurological disease, Parkinson's, ALS, and all that. So you think that's an area of promise?
It's absolutely worth looking at. It's just, I'm wearing my cautious scientific hat now. We'll wait and see what comes through in terms of the evidence.
Okay, then next question, psychedelics and depression. I think you've already answered that, but how about psychedelics, depression, suicidal ideation, existential anxiety, and so on?
Yes, I think the evidence is quite compelling, and I believe it'll grow, and I think the compelling nature of it will become clearer over time. We did a study last year published in New England Journal of Medicine showing that psilocybin therapy is at least as effective and probably more effective than first-line treatments for depression, drug treatments at the moment. The remission rates, meaning you don't have depression anymore, were twice as high in the psilocybin therapy group compared to a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, a classic antidepressant drug called escitalopram. So very promising. And I do, believe that there's solid, science and to this promise. It's not just hype. And the action is, as I alluded to earlier, it's a more holistic action with the psychedelic opening up the psyche, that being combined with supportive psychotherapy. And it's really that, combination of, yes, a direct drug action, but also the supportive psychotherapy that seems to be getting people better.
Okay, so in that context also, want to share something with you. Our foundation is very heavily invested in supporting research and also bringing some solutions to suicidal ideation in teenagers. So, as you probably know, it's the second most common cause of death in teenagers is now suicide. First being accidents, which is related to drug abuse as well. So about 2 years ago, we created an emotional chatbot named after an English-French recording artist who died of suicide. And this is an AI that speaks to teens. And interestingly enough, our emotional chatbot has now intervened in 6,000 suicidal ideations. and is having 20 million conversations simultaneously because she's in AI. She can speak to everyone simultaneously, instantly. So we are having amazing results with emotional AI for PTSD amongst veterans, where psychedelics also have an improvement. But we are having amazing results with teens. And the reason I'm asking you this question, if somebody is in their teens and is responsive to these emotional AI interventions, deep learning systems, do you think there's a role for either microdosing or psychedelic as an adjunctive treatment for teen depression and teen suicidal ideation? This is a very important question because I'm asked this all the time.
It is a very important question because early mental health is the most reliable predictor of adult mental health. And so, you know, what's happening during that critical period is critically important. And so, you know, if young people are developing mental illnesses, then there's a very strong argument to intervene to try and deal with that early so that they can live a fulfilling adult life. And so, yes, they're vulnerable. Yes, there's risk, but also there's promise and hope and such good reason to try and intervene at that stage. And so, you know, when framed in that way, you can think about being bold about intervening. You know, many young people, teenagers, are prescribed medications that are quite blunt tools, really, for treating mental illness and come with side effects and could impact development in, you know, complicated ways that might not always be so helpful. So, you know, if there are alternative interventions that don't involve people being on drugs all the time, but yes, you use a medicine to catalyze a process like a, you know, important psychotherapeutic process, or a relearning process like your AI bot, I imagine, is working on people's sort of cognitive biases that say they're worthless or that life isn't worth living, and sort of inviting them to sort of correct maybe those biases, then that relearning mechanism could, in theory, be catalyzed by a low dose of a psychedelic. It makes sense that
so you're open to that kind of investigation and, you know, actually working with teens in this area as well.
Yeah, I think we should be, and we've done some preliminary analyses looking at data that we collected through prospective questionnaires tracking people over time, and in our sample, which was quite big, we could look at adolescents selectively, and we did, and we looked to see whether they are the same as the rest of the population in terms of how they respond to psychedelics, and mostly they are. So the general principle is we see improvements in indices of mental health. There were some subtle differences, which I'll briefly raise. One of them was around, typically in adults, we see that if people rate ego dissolution during the drug experience, that is actually a positive predictor of positive improvements in mental health. In the younger cohort, that rule wasn't so strong. And one of the reasons for that we intuit is that their egos are just developing at that age. So that speaks to the special vulnerability at that age for at least big doses of psychedelics having this ego dissolution effect when their egos aren't matured, you might say. And of course, there are, you know, pluses and minuses to having a mature ego, but I guess we can accept that it's a period of some instability in terms of ego development and perhaps some special risk of having an ego destabilizing drug at that age, but special risk, special opportunity, you know, depends what you do with that with
If
that
you
plastic
can have
touch.
a healthy, mature ego, as you said, the mature ego, a healthy ego is part of our. Unfortunately, most egos aren't healthy and mature, even in adults. So there may be a role there. So, well, thank you for answering that question. And, one of my final questions is, I've been also interested for a long time in something called terminal lucidity, and I've asked my neuroscience colleagues if this is a real phenomenon, terminal lucidity, where people, when they're dying, some people, not all, 5% maybe, even when they have Alzheimer's, and or some kind of, sometimes even on a ventilator, but before they die, a few minutes or a few days, they have extreme clarity, lucidity. So I never believed in the phenomenon, not having seen, but then I called my neuroscience colleagues and they say some of them are very interested in that. And so recently I've sat with my neuropsychiatrist, MD, with some people in the last stages of life. And particularly one example was my own literary agent who's worked with me for 35 years, and she was very close to me as a family. I've written 95 books and she helped me with a lot of them. And she was dying of brain cancer recently. So I sat with her with a ketamine session, and she had such clarity and such joy at that experience that she was not at all afraid of, transitioning from this life to the next, or whatever that dimension is, if any. But what do you think of psychedelics and terminal care, and especially in, terminal care with compassion, which a lot of patients don't get?
Yes. Well, some of the most compelling and human research that's been done with psychedelics in recent years has focused on anxiety and depression in relation to terminal diagnoses and the dying process and the prospect of dying, the closer prospect of dying. And the likes of Roland Griffiths and the Johns Hopkins team, and Stephen Ross and others at NYU, Charlie Grove, UCLA. I mean, there's some fantastic work in this area looking at psilocybin therapy for end-of-life anxiety. It's very promising. It's very human. Maybe somewhat sadly, it hasn't been picked up by medicine regulators in the way that, say, psychedelic therapy for depression and PTSD has been, because they don't recognize it as a diagnostic category. What is fear of dying? That's just a universal human thing, but does it have to be? I just recently read Timothy Leary when he was given his terminal cancer diagnosis, and perhaps in sort of typical Leary-esque style, said he was thrilled and he was going to throw a death party. And sure, you might say, oh, he's using humor as an escape mechanism, defense mechanism there, but it's kind of funny. And there is, other cultures, of course, have a different approach to dying, and the way Buddhism looks at the dying process, I think, can be very, very healthy. So there's more good work to be done in that space. Absolutely.
So you do encourage that. You do encourage.
Absolutely, and people can intuit the mechanism. When your life is close to ending, the ego will rage against the dying light, and it doesn't want to go. And it's a natural and human reaction. But just to invite that letting go, and to have the psychedelic and its ego dissolving action sort of show the individual, the living being, that it's not something necessarily to be so scared of. Is very, very powerful.
So since you mentioned Timothy Leary, I'm going to just turn the computer screen so you can see something. You see that painting that I just came into view?
Ah, yeah.
That's
Cool.
Timothy Leary, painted during the last phase of his life, as he was going through the psychedelic experience. Let me show you the painting close up.
Okay. Beautiful colors.
Yeah, well, I'm sure he saw them all. I'm sure he saw them all. So one final thing, and I'll let you go. You've been very gracious with your time. Once a year, you've moved from Britain now to San Diego, right?
That's right. I'm actually in Berkeley. Yeah, I'm in the Bay Area and have my connection with UCSF.
UCSF. So yeah. Oh, I thought UCSD. Sorry, I'm at UCSD. You're at UCSF, right?
Right.
Okay. Yeah. And are you living in California now?
Yeah, I live in California, in Berkeley, California, and the city is just not so far away.
But you're from England, Bristol, right?
Yeah, I'm from England.
So once a year, our foundation, and again, you never have to say yes or no to any request, but once a year, our foundation, which is the Chopra Foundation, works in collaboration with a community in Florida, which is called the Lake Nona Forum, founded by a British entrepreneur, actually, Joe Lewis, who made a lot of money in the George Soros days with the British pound. He owns the British football teams. At one time, owned all the pubs all over England. He's in his mid-80s. He plays tennis every day. He lives on a yacht. And he's created this community called Lake Nona, which has 35,000 citizens, with people settled there. Unlike the rest of Florida, most of the population is in their 40s, or actually 30s. And of the 35,000 people that live there or living there, we have 1,000 citizen scientists there who are donating their data from birth to death. It's the most ambitious thing. And Joe Lewis is the champion behind a lot of the things we're doing. The reason I'm mentioning this is once a year, we have something called the Lake Nona Forum. And we invite people to be part of a panel. And so we've had everyone from the president of Disney to President Clinton to the Surgeon General. And we have coming up in February a Lake Nona Forum again. And we have a very special session on psychedelics. Most people who are attending that session or on that panel are outside of academia. I've talked to Michael Pollan and other people. A lot of them are actually probably funders for psychedelic research. A lot of them are from the business community. But if I sent you an invitation to be part of a panel, would you consider it? That's all I'm asking.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I would jump at the opportunity, yeah.
Okay. Well, then that's my last request and question. I will be sharing with you, and we'll have a lot of psychedelic experts there, but not somebody who's as qualified as you from academia. So it would be a very, very interesting thing to have you on the panel. And if you would consider it, we'd be very grateful.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like a wonderful opportunity. Yeah.
Okay.